A long time ago, in the year of 2010, we received a lot of incredible video games. Some alive today may remember Halo Reach or even Fallout New Vegas. But what if I told you about a game that spawned a cult classic? A game that quite a few people today have not played. I speak of Darksiders. And yes, 2010 was basically the Stone Age compared to today's technology. Don't at me. Darksiders may not have been as popular as, say, Call of Duty or the like, but it was popular enough to continue the franchise with sequels. 3 other games, in fact, with riveting names such as Darksiders 2, Darksiders 3, and here's the kicker, a spin-off game called Darksiders Genesis. See the path it was following there? Jokes aside, I love this franchise. This series has such a great art style, personality, and setting. It's just the right amount of edginess to not be straight up cringe. The life cycle of the franchise has been an interesting one. Developed by Vigil Games under the THQ umbrella came Darksiders 1 and 2. Though shortly after the second game came out, THQ went under, and that put Darksiders on ice for a while there. A company called Nordic acquired the Darksiders property and eventually gave Gunfire Games the task of continuing the series, starting with Darksiders 3. A development studio called Airship Syndicate are also the ones behind the spin-off game Darksiders Genesis. Since Nordic bought up quite a few parts of the old THQ, they've since become THQ Nordic. Wait a minute. I see what you did there. The games follow the various journeys of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: war, death, fury, and strife. Each game puts the player in the shoes of one of the individual horsemen. The first in the series has war. Darksiders 2 has death, 3 has fury, and Genesis is a bit unique here, giving you access to both strife and war. All the games take place roughly around the same time, with the exception of Genesis being far earlier in the timeline. While we have all of those games, we still don't have any announcement of Darksiders 4 yet. A lot of people think it'll have Strife as the main protagonist based on the history of the series. That being said, we're here to talk about the first game. Darksiders 1 is the obvious introduction to the franchise as a whole. Naturally, because of that, war is the first one you see, play as, and see the world through. Funnily enough, Darksiders 1 also happens to be the latest game in terms of the overall timeline. The sequel games take place during the events of the first game and end sooner. I like this approach to the story. It makes it so you get introduced to all 4 of the horsemen before the game where they're all together. The series has plenty of lore bits in it that players won't entirely understand just by playing the games. For example, the characters will talk about certain objects and characters that they know before the player has any idea. Sure, they do explain them in the same conversation, but sometimes it feels like a ton of exposition rather than something more natural in conversation. Kind of like you're the third wheel of the group. You're part of the team, but you don't understand what your friends are talking about while they're making all the major decisions. Darksiders 1 is an action-adventure style of game. So you know what? How about we hop into the game proper now? This is Darksiders. The gameplay of Darksiders has a few different games it takes from. A lot of people point out it's similar to The Legend of Zelda since it has dungeons, puzzles, and items to help with traversal. It makes sense why people see that, but the game is deeper than just that. You play as War, one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, sporting a dashing red hood, riding on his steed, and going over rivers. Unfortunately, he's not heading to grandmother's house. He's on a mission, one of very great importance. So let's first talk about the various different locations he'll visit on his mission. The locations you travel to are all zoned off with pathways to travel between them. Each zone has its own look and feel with enemies to fight of varying difficulty. The zones are cool in design with the art style the game has, something that gets further refined in the sequel. A lot of the time spent in each zone is the player trying to travel through all of it, finding all the items you need, fighting enemies along the way, and moving on to the boss of the zone. It's a formulaic approach that works well enough as a concept, but when you put everything together, it gives Darksiders its own identity from other games in its genre. When you start the game, the tutorial gives you a number of obstacles to overcome while telling you how. Jumping, double jumping, climbing, and grabbing ledges are some of the ways to get around said obstacles. This is just stuff in the beginning of the game that you can do. As the game opens up and you get to more zones, you get access to traversal equipment. These items are a great way to have the player feel some sort of progression when it comes to getting further and further into the game. Not to mention, some can be used in different ways to help out the player. The Earth Caller, for example, is primarily used to wake up gatekeepers so you can progress forward. However, you can use it in combat to knock enemies back. The Crossblade is basically a giant ninja shuriken that War can use in a variety of ways, from locking onto targets in a sequence to make sure they're all hit, slowing down time, and even attacking enemies. Very versatile equipment I expect you can find at just about any hardware store. But of course, how can we forget about Mercy? It's one of the items that Strife has in his arsenal that War gets access to. I can already hear some of you asking how you can use a gun for traversal. There's a very simple way to explain this. You shoot enemies in your path, and they're no longer in your path. Yes, a very complicated thing to do in this game of demons and angels. What's a cool thing to add to any adventure game? That's right, hook shot. So another thing to look at here is that in these various zones, there's almost always something that'll be just out of your reach. You need certain equipment to be able to make it to the spots in question to find out what's there. Typically, it's equipment that you get further in game. This is something that's used in game development quite often in this style of game. Developers like to use this to give players a reason to go back into previously cleared out zones. It's kind of like a carrot on a stick. A player sees somewhere they can't reach, makes a mental note of it for later, gets the item they need to pass the obstacle in the previous location, then they get some really cool items like blue souls. Wait a minute. By the way, blue souls are the currency in Darksiders, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So one of the biggest reasons for getting and using the equipment in the game is the puzzles in every zone. These puzzles can range from easy to thought-provoking. This is the second time I've gone through this game, and I can tell you that I was able to figure out some of the puzzles that took me a while the first time, much faster. It might be because I'm older, or maybe I have some little bits of memory from the game. Who knows? But it does feel great when you complete a puzzle. The vast majority of puzzles are used in the various zones to halt player progress. While yes, they do stop you from moving too fast, there's still a nice addition to the game to break up having only combat. And unless you accidentally figure out a puzzle here and there, chances are you're going to remember how to work your way around them should you come back later for any reason. Some of the hidden items in the game are purposefully just out of sight. The developers went out of their way to figure out what the point of view of the player would be at certain points of the levels. Figuring this out, they could put something just out of the player's normal view to where they might just run past it, not even knowing something was there. Some of these spots are even hidden through mechanics that only the most eagle-eyed players will notice, or ones with access to YouTube. One thing I will add to this is that it felt pretty great to accidentally come across hidden items while going through the level. If I had looked it up prior to that, I probably wouldn't have felt so good about finding it. After you've cleared a zone, you can go back to it at any time. You can walk back through all the pathways connecting to the zones you've left, or you can find some certain spots in all the levels where a demon named Vulgrim will give you the ability to teleport to any of the previous locations you found him in. This is called a serpent hole. It's essentially a tunnel you can walk through to go from place to place. I do like the transition, as well as the rocks that float into place like a self-solving puzzle. Really cool aesthetics in play here. As for the combat, War has quite the arsenal at his disposal. From his huge sword, Chaos Eater, to a scythe, and even a tremor gauntlet. You can vary up your approach to dealing damage on just about anything you come up against. Close quarters enemy, sword. Tanky enemy, sword. Flying and ranged enemy, sword. Also, punchy, shooty, and slashy scythe in there too. So for the major combat, you have yourself a 4-hit combo with your sword. You can dash to dodge incoming attacks, as well as add other weapons into the mix to change things up. It feels really good overall, but don't get too reliant on dashing. You can launch enemies into the air by holding the attack button, but if you hold it for even longer, War himself will jump into the air with the enemy he hits. While in the air, you have access to more normal swings with a somersault finisher. At any time in the air, if you hold the attack button, War can do an even flashier and more damaging somersault attack into the ground. You can lock on to enemies to keep the camera focused on them while you hold the button, something that works best when you're not surrounded by many different enemies. However, if you feel you need to use it in groups of enemies, you can switch focus at a moment's notice with the right analog stick. Other than that, hack and slash away. War has HP as well as a combat currency to use called Wrath. It's the yellow bars underneath his health. There are certain skills that you can use that cost Wrath bars. These are big skills that can either do immense amounts of damage to enemies or even buff War in certain ways. Like the Wrath ability Blade Geyser. War stabs his sword into the ground to summon a lot of deadly blades around him, doing massive damage to enemies too close. You can map these Wrath abilities to different buttons as you like, though there are only 4 buttons you can work with at a time, so make sure you go with what complements your style the most. There's one more source of combat currency. That would be the Chaos Meter. Imagine the Hulk. Now imagine him red. Now imagine him on fire with a sword. This is War's Chaos form. Invulnerable to damage, heavy hitting, and huge swings of his sword. You could say he's a monster here, but the thing is, the amount of time he can use this form is very small. It's basically your oh shit button. The Chaos Meter goes up through combat, mostly through War's sword Chaos Eater. Defeating enemies will raise the bar, though the only time you can use the form is when the meter is filled. There are other skills that you can acquire from the vendor Vulgrim that just add more to your overall moveset. For instance, there's a skill that you can use if you dash toward an enemy and hit the attack button, or stabs his sword forward to deal damage. Anyone up for some shish kebab? How about doing a super somersault? Not all of the skills are just for War's sword Chaos Eater. There's even skills for his other 2 main weapons, the Scythe and the Tremor Gauntlet. Spend blue souls to purchase those from Vulgrim as well. While you can only use one of these 2 weapons at a time, you can switch between them on the fly. War Smash! When a button appears on the top of an enemy, this is called an execution, something that the YouTube overlords hate. Executions will show up either when an enemy is near death or under special circumstances. This is something that allows War to instantly finish off his opponents, or bring a boss to the next stage. Being that it's a finisher, War will get souls for his effort, be it health, blue souls, or even wrath. It's dependent on the enemy in question. Some enemies you can perform the executions on immediately rather than having to lower their HP. When you add up all 3 different weapons, they add quite the arsenal to War, especially if you mix things up between all of them while in combat. Hell, why not throw a shuriken or shoot mercy at the enemies to even further switch things up? When you add in the various different locations that you fight in, you can try using your environment to your advantage. Pesky enemies blocking your path? Car. War also has access to consumables. These are all beneficial in one way or another. Health potions, wrath potions, chaos meter, and revival. These essentially get put into any empty consumables that War has in his inventory. You can get more empty slots throughout the game, maxing out at a total of 8 slots. That's a lot of healing. You can purchase these from Vulgrim as well. While this may be a complaint for some, I can say that there's a section in the game where you go a long period of time without seeing Vulgrim. Because of this, once you get to this place, you're kind of on your own with what you have. Something like this is a good time to use the health chests sparingly. So what I mean is that when I went into this zone, it was with 2 health potions. I'll go through a section with enemies, and if I'm still good on health, I'll skip the chest at that moment. There will be more enemies. Once I finish the section and turn around, I can top back off with that same chest. It's kind of like a consumable that can only be used in a certain spot. While you do start out fairly weak, you do get much stronger as you get further into the game. All 3 of the primary weapons have a sort of leveling system attached to them, 5 levels in total for each. Just using the weapons by hitting the enemies nets them their own experience to level up. Obviously, leveling up makes them stronger, but leveling up also unlocks more skills for you to purchase from Vulgrim to use in battle. One last piece of gear I want to talk about here is the Abyssal Armor Set. There are 10 pieces you can find throughout the game, all hidden pretty well enough, though one of the pieces is given to you during the story, but that was likely to give the player the knowledge that something like that exists. I was playing this game on the normal difficulty. While it was challenging enough on its own, by the end of the game, I was pretty unstoppable, just absolutely destroying the secret boss, Wicked Killington himself. I can say I definitely felt strong by the end of the game. As you beat enemies, they give you blue souls, green souls, and yellow souls. Each have their own purpose, Green is for healing War, yellow is to raise his wrath bars, and blue is the currency you give to Vulgrim to purchase any number of things. Skills, consumables, and wrath abilities. Quite a few things are available for purchase at Vulgrim's shop. In this game, War travels around on foot a lot. What kind of horseman doesn't have a horse? Introducing Ruin, the trusty steed of War. With Ruin, War can travel in areas much faster than before. While in a desert location, War has a hard time moving. That's where Ruin comes in. With 5 boosts at a time, Ruin is fast. Now let's talk about the story and setting. This section will be filled with spoilers, so if you don't want to hear anything, you might want to click off the video right here. Alright, we good? Cool. Let's dive right in. At the start of the game, meteors are raining from the sky. We find out that these so-called meteors are actually angels and demons mid-combat. It just so happens that War, one of the 4 horsemen, is among them, there to keep balance in all the chaos, answering the call. But there's something wrong. The 7 seals have to all be broken to bring forth the apocalypse. That time was set far in the future when the children of man would be able to defend themselves as the third party in this war. This is far too early. War keeps moving forward. Hearing a horn from somewhere, he gets weaker. So many questions. Coming across Abaddon, once the angel spots War, he says something very peculiar.
Impossible. Abaddon. What is this? Where are my brothers? This cannot be. The final seal.
My lord!
How did this happen? The 7th seal was not broken!
And then he's finished off by Straga, the big demon guy thing. Better keep an eye on this one. I meant figuratively, not literally. After a short tussle with War involving a lot of cars to the face, War once again gets weaker to the point where even he gets finished off by Straga. Something is very wrong here. This is the very beginning of the game. It's the tutorial as well as the setup for the story. Lots of questions naturally pop up. Why was War losing his strength? What did Abaddon know? What was the cause of this conflict? It's a great setup to get the player interested in the game. The need to find out what happened, to understand what the various characters were talking about, and so on. After that, War is essentially on trial in front of the Charred Council, the beings that gave him and his fellow horsemen the positions they have. War is being accused of starting the apocalypse early and siding with the demons. He asks the council to send him back to Earth to find the ones responsible, or die trying. They allow it and give him back a weakened Chaos Eater, as well as putting the Watcher on him, keeping an eye on him at all times. He gets back to Earth only to find out that humanity has fallen, and that 100 years have passed since his defeat at the hands of Straga. While the first section was the overall setup for the game, this second section is the beginning of War's journey. To right wrongs, to clear his name, War will stop at nothing to fix what happened. If these first 2 sections weren't clear enough, we're seeing everything through War's eyes. Everything he's witnessed to, when he's witnessed to it, is all we see and know. We really find out who War is since we're around him the entire game, how he interacts with others, his combat style, what deals and betrayals he goes through. It's all there. By the end of the story, War needs to get a stronger sword to fight against the Destroyer. He learns the truth of everything that happened and goes to make things right. After completely bullying the Destroyer, who also happens to be Abaddon, War is killed by Uriel, which sort of sets him free from the Watcher. Uriel then destroys the final seal, thus unleashing the true apocalypse. War comes back to life because of the final seal finally being broken, and the game ends with us seeing that the other 3 horsemen are coming to Earth. It's an easy to understand story from beginning to end. The only parts that may catch people off guard would be when characters are talking about people or objects in a very expository way. Since we know next to nothing about all the lore, this being the first game and all, the various topics they talk about that aren't immediately on screen feels a little tacked on. Regardless, it's not like those topics aren't immediately addressed either. They're explained in the moment and then used shortly thereafter. While this is an action-adventure game, the story is a very strong aspect that helps combine everything to make something truly remarkable. Without the story, you'd be missing most of the personality. It would pretty much be just a big guy swinging a giant stick at enemies and puzzles. While that could still make for a great game, Darksiders is a lore and world-building heavy series. The sum of its parts make it what it is today, and I urge anyone that's interested in seeing more of the game to go get it and play it whenever possible. The main character, War, is very interesting with his own personality. He may seem dark and brooding at first, but as you get further into the story, you start to see what makes him tick. He's not some voiceless protagonist with a fairy tale goal of beating the big bad boss at the end. His goal was to find the ones responsible since the beginning. As an example, there's a part in the story where he finds that specific information he's looking for to clear his name. What does he do with it? He turns around and starts to head back to the Charred Council to clear his name instead of cleaning up everything. What a gigachad. Naturally, this is a video game with a big bad boss at the end, so he has to get forced to see it through to the end. Regardless, it shows more layers to War than just being edgy, and that's a great thing. War is not the only character with a strong personality. Sure, the story is hinging on his success, but it's all the other characters in the game that make the world feel more fleshed out. Things are moving in the background with the various groups. When you go to a zone, you see what people have been doing in those areas before War gets there. After making it to the Ashlands, a sand-covered desert, you see a variety of ways what the story was there. The story is told through dialogue, environmental storytelling, the types of enemies, and the pathway you take to finish the zone. War is still getting stronger since the beginning of the game, so he needs help from extra powers and tools to get through alive and continue his journey to prove his innocence. There are sections where War can run and fight normally, as well as areas that have a higher concentration of sand which impedes War's various movements. The sand slows him down and he can only jump once. The mechanic placed here is these giant worms you have to work around. The worms are specifically in the sand hunting anything that would be foolish enough to try to go through it. One of War's new powers allows him to slow down time with certain objects, making it so he can outpace the worms. The environment and the enemies here are what tell the story in this section. There are no enemies in the sand that can't move fast so as to avoid the giant sandworms. There are certain pathways where you and enemies can walk much more safely from the worms themselves. So because of the various dangers here, War can't take on the sandworms yet, so he must run from them and take the high road. There are a lot of ways the game will have you continue going from zone to zone, either by going through one zone to the next, or by giving you something story-wise that brings you to the next zone. Like for example, a section where War rides on a griffin. By the way, this game has the best griffin design I have seen in any game. Regardless, this is an on-rails section where War is flying along to the next zone in the story. Not only that, but when you finally arrive there, the griffin is fighting the boss of the zone, which ends up knocking War off his new mount to have to go through the puzzle-filled level. Even with that happening, the environmental storytelling is hard at work here by giving you many times where you see and hear the griffin and boss fighting. While you already know the outcome of that fight, considering that's the boss of the level, it's still a really cool touch that adds to the overall zone. A really cool touch at that. How often in games do you get a cinematic going on throughout the entire level, especially back in the 360 and PS3 era of gaming? Not much, I'll tell you. So that's a bit of what you can expect to see in the story of the game. But what about the world and setting? So we already know that the apocalypse of Earth was set in motion. So after the beginning sequence of the game, you now see the Earth in a post-apocalyptic setting of sorts. One where there's monsters, demons, and angels all in combat for over 100 years. The cities are falling into ruin, and there's no living humans in sight. This is a worst-case scenario event for the human race. Fallen cities, deserts with monstrously huge predators, and even beings from outside of Earth all duking it out to come out on top. Earth is now the home of otherworldly beings, ones with vast amounts of power and influence in their own hierarchies. This is essentially one big hellscape. Even with all we see happening on Earth, all these angels and demons had to come from somewhere. Who they are, who they're aligned with, and what their goals are things that help to give the world this game takes place in more personality. If you have two factions in a game duking it out, you see that it's two opposing forces that are shaping the world, both positively and negatively. But when you add in a third party, one capable of keeping the other two in line, what happens is it adds an amount of nuance to the Darksiders universe. When there's a lot of moving parts in the background, things get more complex. These complexities help to make a convincing story and setting. As far as the settings go, I'd say this is a really strong one. A great start to the franchise. Also, Ulthane is amazing.
Go on, fly away, pigeons, before I pluck ya. That's what you get for touching what ain't yours. I'd duck if I were you. Do I look like I'm afraid of death, boy?
I love the Darksiders franchise a lot. I saw it for the first time in college when one of my roommates played it on his PS3. It was that moment that I knew I needed to get that game. So naturally, I got the game shortly after that. I was blown away by how much I enjoyed it and seeing the potential of the franchise. The world just sucked me in and I wanted to know more. After seeing the ending where we saw the other three horsemen were on their way to Earth, I wanted to see who they all were, their designs, and what they could do. You see, it was absolutely sequel baiting. But even with that, my first expectation was that the series would start with war and then have all four horsemen together going forward for the sequels. As it turns out, the sequels would have us playing the other horsemen in their own individual journeys, taking place roughly in the same time period as the first game. I'll be taking a look at those at a later time. As far as various game series go, this is a very strong start. From all the aspects of the gameplay, the story, and the setting, we see quite a bit but don't have too many answers to all of our questions. Even with that being the case, it's not like the series hasn't had its fair share of hardships, what with the changing of studios and THQ going bankrupt. We still don't know anything on Darksiders 4 outside of the fact that it'll likely have Strife as the main character. There's rumors on the internet here and there, but no real definitive proof of it being real. Not to mention, Gunfire Games, the developers behind Darksiders 3, just released their newest game, Remnant 2. Are they working on Darksiders 4? Is the series in limbo right now? I sure hope not. I love the games, the characters, and the universe they take place in. I still want to see more, and maybe you all do too. Hopefully the future holds some great results for us. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you liked the video, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Adios.